The scream tore through the ballroom before anyone could stop it, and Alina Hartley crumpled to the marble floor as the music stopped mid-note. Glasses shattered. Silk skirts rustled as guests backed away. Alina's fingers clawed at her own throat as if she could not breathe, and her husband, Duke Gareth Ashcombe, stood frozen near the fireplace, watching his wife shake on the ground surrounded by strangers who dared not touch a duchess without permission. It was Margaret, her maid, who reached her first, kneeling on the cold floor in her good dress, cradling Alina's head and shouting for a physician. The crowd parted like water. Somewhere behind them, a woman whispered that the duchess had been pale for weeks, that everyone had seen it coming, that a marriage without a child after 4 years was already cursed. Gareth did not kneel. He did not reach for his wife's hand. He stood with his jaw tight and his eyes cold, watching the scene as though it were happening to someone else's family, someone else's future. The physician arrived within the hour. Dr. Alistair Crane was a narrow man with narrow eyes, known throughout the capital for his precise diagnoses and his even more precise fees. He examined Alina in her private chamber while Gareth waited outside the door, arms crossed, refusing to sit. When Crane finally emerged, his face carried the practiced solemnity of a man delivering bad news he did not entirely feel. "Your Grace," he said, "I am sorry to tell you this. The Duchess suffers from a wasting sickness of the blood. It explains her fainting, her fatigue, the paleness in her skin. And there is something else you must know." Gareth's voice was flat. "Say it." "Her body will not carry a child," Crane said. "It never will. I have seen this condition before. It is final." The words fell into the hallway like stones into still water, and something in Gareth's face closed like a door being locked from the inside. He did not ask if there was treatment. He did not ask if Crane could be wrong. He did not go into the room where his wife lay pale and trembling, waiting to hear her fate from the man who had promised to love her. Instead, he turned and walked toward his study, and by the time the candles burned low that night, he had already begun writing to his lawyers. Alina did not learn the truth from her husband. She learned it from Margaret, who came to her the next morning with red eyes and shaking hands, carrying a folded letter sealed with the Ashcombe crest. "I am sorry, my lady," Margaret whispered. "I am so sorry." Alina opened the letter with fingers that did not yet understand what they were about to read. The words were formal, cold, precise, exactly the way Gareth spoke when he wanted no room for argument. The marriage was to be annulled. Her belongings were to be removed from the estate by morning. A carriage would take her to the old family cottage near Bramwell, far from the capital, far from the life she had built, far from the man she had once loved with her whole foolish heart. There was no signature of affection, no apology, just his name written the way a man signs a business contract. Alina read it 3 times before the paper slipped from her hands. She had been sick for a matter of days. She had been his wife for 4 years, and in the space of one night, without a single word spoken to her face, he had erased her. Margaret helped her dress in silence, because there was nothing left to say that would not break what little strength Alina had remaining. The servants who had once curtsied to her now averted their eyes, unsure whether they were permitted to show kindness to a woman who was, by the stroke of a pen, no longer their duchess. Alina walked through the halls of the estate one final time. She passed the portrait gallery where her wedding painting still hung, her young face bright with hope beside Gareth's proud, unreadable expression. She passed the nursery that had been prepared 2 years earlier in a moment of misplaced optimism, its little cradle still standing empty, gathering dust in the corner like a monument to a future that would never arrive. She did not cry. She had cried enough the night before in private where no one could see the Duchess break. At the front steps, the carriage waited. Margaret climbed in beside her without being asked, refusing to let her mistress travel alone, and the driver snapped the reins before Alina could look back one last time at the only home she had known since she was 19 years old. Gareth watched from an upstairs window. He told himself it was necessity, not cruelty. He told himself a duke without an heir was a duke without a future, and a wife who could not give him a child was a wife who had already failed him, sickness or not. He told himself many things that morning, and none of them made the hollow feeling in his chest disappear. The road to Bramwell was long and cold, winding through hills gone brown with early winter, and Alina sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window at a world that no longer had a place for her in it. Somewhere along that road, deep inside her body, something the doctors had missed and the Duke had never considered was quietly, silently, preparing to prove them all wrong. By the time the carriage reached the cottage, dusk had fallen, and Alina felt a pain low in her back that she mistook, at first, for the ache of hours spent sitting still. The cottage was small, but it was clean, tucked at the edge of a village called Fenmore where the air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. An elderly caretaker named Agnes Fenwick met them at the door, her lined face full of quiet sympathy, having already heard from a passing messenger that the young woman arriving that evening was no longer to be called Duchess. Agnes did not ask questions. She simply opened the door wider and told Margaret to bring in the bags before the rain started. That night, as the fire crackled low in the hearth and Margaret dozed in a chair beside the bed, Alina felt the pain return, sharper this time, wrapping around her middle like a fist. She sat up, breathing hard, one hand pressed to her stomach, and for one confused, terrified moment, she thought her sickness had finally caught up with her, that this was the end Dr. Crane had warned of. Then the pain came again, and this time it did not feel like sickness at all. Margaret woke to her mistress's sharp intake of breath and was at her side in an instant, taking one look at Alina's face and understanding, with the strange clarity that comes in moments of crisis, that something extraordinary was happening. "My lady," Margaret said carefully, "how long have you felt unwell in your stomach?" Alina could barely speak through the pain. "Weeks," she managed. "Dr. Crane said it was the sickness spreading." Margaret's eyes went wide, and she was already moving toward the door, already calling out into the night for Agnes, because a lifetime of working in noble households had taught her exactly what this kind of pain meant, and it had nothing to do with any wasting sickness of the blood. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters of the little cottage, as if the world itself understood that everything was about to change. Agnes came running with a lantern and a face gone pale with sudden understanding, and behind her, Alina's soft, disbelieving voice rose above the wind. "It cannot be," she whispered, pressing both hands to the place where the pain gathered and grew. "It cannot be true." But it was true, and there was no more time left to doubt it. Agnes had delivered 40 children in her lifetime, and she knew within moments that this one was coming fast, faster than most, as if the child inside Alina had been waiting for its own kind of freedom. "There is no time to send for a doctor from town," Agnes said, already rolling up her sleeves. "We do this here tonight, the three of us." Margaret's hands trembled as she gathered clean linens from the small chest by the window, but her voice stayed steady when she spoke to Alina, the way a good friend's voice stays steady even when her heart is racing. "You are stronger than you know, my lady," Margaret said, kneeling beside the bed and taking Alina's hand. "Whatever they told you about your body, they were wrong. Look at what your body is doing right now." Alina laughed through the pain, a broken, disbelieving sound, because for 4 years she had been told her body was a failure, a disappointment, a thing that could not do the one task expected of a duchess, and now here it was doing exactly that, alone in a cottage far from the man who had given up on her. The hours that followed blurred together into pain and effort, and the low, steady voice of Agnes guiding her through each wave, telling her when to rest and when to push, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth, never once letting fear enter her tone even when Alina's strength seemed to falter. Outside, the wind died down as the night deepened, and inside the small cottage, 3 women worked together with a kind of fierce determination that had nothing to do with titles or bloodlines or the cruel judgments of physicians who charged handsomely to be wrong. Near dawn, when the sky outside the window had just begun to turn the color of pale ash, Elinor gave one last cry that seemed to shake the very walls of the cottage. And then, suddenly, impossibly, there was another sound in the room. A small, furious cry, high and strong, filling every corner of the tiny bedroom with a kind of noise that Elinor had once believed she would never hear in her own home. "A boy," Agnes said, and her voice cracked with something like joy as she wrapped the infant in a soft cloth and placed him gently on Elinor's chest. "A healthy, strong boy." Elinor stared down at the small, red, furious face of her son, and for a long moment she could not speak at all. She had been told she was barren. She had been told her body was failing. She had been discarded, cast aside, sent away like a piece of furniture no longer fashionable enough for the main house. And here, in her arms, wrapped in a stranger's linen in a borrowed cottage at the edge of a forgotten village, was the answer to every lie she had been told. "He has your eyes," Margaret whispered, tears streaming freely down her face now that there was no more need to be strong for anyone. "And Agnes, look at his hands, look at those little fingers." Agnes smiled, the exhausted, satisfied smile of a woman who had just witnessed something she would remember for the rest of her days. "He will be trouble, that one," she said. "Look how loud he cries. That is not the cry of a weak child." Elinor pressed her lips to her son's forehead, and for the first time since the ballroom floor had risen up to meet her, since the cold letter had arrived sealed with a crest she no longer had the right to wear, she felt something other than grief. She felt fury. Because somewhere, less than a day's ride away, a man was waking up in a grand estate, believing he had rid himself of a sick, barren wife, never once imagining that the woman he had thrown away in the dark of night had given him, in the very same darkness, the one thing he had wanted more than anything else in the world. An heir. The morning light crept slowly through the small window, and Elinor sat up carefully, her son sleeping against her chest, his tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of new life. Margaret had already gone to fetch warm water and clean cloths, moving through the little cottage with the brisk efficiency of someone determined to make everything right, as if perfect linens and warm broth could somehow undo the cruelty of the night before. Agnes sat by the fire, watching mother and child with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know that truth had a way of surfacing no matter how deeply people tried to bury it. "You must decide something, my lady," Agnes said carefully and soon. "Word of a birth like this does not stay quiet in a village this small. By tomorrow, the miller's wife will know. By the day after, half of Fenmore will know. And villages talk to travelers, and travelers talk to servants, and servants talk to their masters." Elinor looked down at her son's small face, so peaceful now after his furious entrance into the world, and she understood exactly what Agnes meant. There was no keeping this secret. There was no reason to keep it secret. The truth was hers now, undeniable and small and warm in her arms, and she would not hide it out of shame for a diagnosis that had never been true in the first place. "Let them talk," Elinor said quietly, and her voice, though tired, carried a new kind of steel that had not been there the night before. "Let the whole capital know that the duchess they called sick and barren gave the Ashcombe line its heir the very night her husband cast her aside." Margaret paused in the doorway, a basin of water in her hands, and looked at her mistress with something like awe. "My lady," she said softly, "you sound like yourself again." Elinor managed a small, tired smile, though her eyes were still red from the night's exhaustion. "I sound like a mother," she said. "And a mother does not apologize for surviving." The days that followed passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. The village of Fenmore, small and simple as it was, seemed to close protectively around Elinor and her son almost immediately. The miller's wife arrived on the second day with a basket of fresh bread and eggs, saying nothing of gossip but plenty of warm well-wishes. The village healer, a soft-spoken woman named Constance, came to check on the baby and declared him strong as a young ox, much to Agnes's delighted agreement. No one in Fenmore cared about titles or annulments, or the cruel arithmetic of noble bloodlines. They cared that a young woman had come to them frightened and alone, and that she had given birth to a healthy child in the middle of the night with only 2 other women beside her, and that was enough to earn her their quiet loyalty. But word did travel, exactly as Agnes had predicted, and it traveled faster than any of them could have imagined. It began with a stable boy who had driven a merchant's cart through Fenmore and heard the story from a farmer at the local inn. It continued when the merchant repeated the tale at a coaching station 2 villages over, embellishing it slightly with each retelling, until by the time it reached the outskirts of the capital, the story had become something almost legendary. The duchess, who was called too sick and too barren to keep her husband's love, banished in the dead of night, had given birth to a strong and healthy son before the sun had even risen on her first day of exile. It was the kind of story that spread through kitchens and stables and parlors alike because it had everything people loved best: betrayal, cruelty, and a twist of fate so perfectly timed that it felt almost like justice delivered by some unseen hand. By the time the story reached the ears of Duke Gareth Ashcombe himself, it did not arrive quietly through a private letter or a careful word from a trusted advisor. It arrived in the form of a furious, red-faced steward bursting into his study, without so much as a knock, breathless from having ridden hard through the night to bring the news before someone else could deliver it first and claim credit for the shock on the Duke's face. "Your Grace," the steward said, gasping for breath, "forgive the intrusion, but you must hear this at once. It concerns Her Grace, the former Duchess." Gareth did not look up from the papers on his desk. "She is no longer my concern," he said flatly. "Whatever news you carry can wait until morning." "It cannot wait, Your Grace," the steward said, and something in his tone finally made Gareth set down his pen. "She has given birth, last night, in a cottage near Fenmore, to a son." The words hung in the air of the study like smoke that would not clear, and for a long moment Gareth simply stared at the man in front of him as though he had spoken in a foreign language. "That is not possible," Gareth said slowly. "Dr. Crane examined her himself. He said she could not carry a child. He said it was final." The steward, to his credit, did not flinch from the Duke's growing fury. "I only know what I have been told, Your Grace," he said carefully. "The child was born strong and healthy. There were witnesses. The village healer confirmed it. It is already the talk of 3 counties. Gareth rose from his chair so quickly that it toppled backward onto the floor, the sound cracking through the silent study like a gunshot. His mind raced through the events of the past days, searching for some explanation, some way this could be a mistake, some detail that would make the impossible truth make sense. And slowly, terribly, a different kind of understanding began to dawn on him. If the child had been born the night after Alina arrived at the cottage, if the birth had come so quickly and so fully formed, then the child had not been conceived in some desperate, impossible moment after her exile. The child had already existed, growing quietly inside her, on the very night he signed the papers that cast her out of his life forever. Which meant that everything Dr. Crane had told him, the diagnosis that had shattered 4 years of marriage in a single conversation, had been wrong. Catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. Or it had never been true at all. Gareth stood frozen in the wreckage of his own certainty, the toppled chair still rocking slightly on the floor beside him, and for the first time since he had watched his wife collapse on the ballroom floor, he felt something close to fear. "Send for Dr. Crane," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now, tonight, I do not care what hour it is." The steward hesitated. "And the child, Your Grace? What shall be done about the child?" Gareth's jaw tightened, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a weight that made the steward take an involuntary step backward. "The child," Gareth said quietly, "is the heir to everything I have, and I have never even seen his face." Dr. Alistair Crane arrived at the Ashcombe estate just before midnight, summoned from his bed by a rider who refused to explain why, only that the Duke demanded his presence immediately. Crane walked into the study expecting perhaps a routine follow-up question about the Duchess's condition, some detail he had forgotten to mention. He was not expecting to find Gareth standing in the center of the room with a face like a gathering storm, the broken chair still lying on its side where it had fallen hours earlier. "You told me she was barren," Gareth said, before Crane had even fully crossed the threshold. "You told me it was final. You used that exact word, final." Crane's narrow eyes flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been alarm. "Your Grace, I examined the Duchess thoroughly. Her symptoms were consistent with a condition that affects fertility in a permanent way. I stand by my diagnosis." "Then explain to me," Gareth said, his voice dangerously quiet, "how a woman with a permanent condition that prevents her from carrying a child gave birth to a healthy son less than 24 hours after I signed the papers ending our marriage." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Crane's composure finally began to crack around the edges. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again, searching for words that would not come. "I was not aware of any pregnancy," Crane said finally, his voice thinner than before. "Sometimes these things are difficult to detect in the early stages, especially when other symptoms are present. It is possible I was mistaken about the timeline of her illness, but the underlying condition itself—" "Enough," Gareth snapped. "I want to know exactly how much you were paid and by whom to deliver that diagnosis." Crane's face went pale, and in that single moment of naked fear, Gareth understood that he had struck upon the truth before Crane had even attempted to deny it. "Your Grace, I do not know what you are suggesting." "I am suggesting," Gareth said, stepping closer, "that a physician of your reputation does not simply guess wrong about something as significant as this. I am suggesting that someone paid you to tell me my wife could never give me an heir, knowing exactly what I would do with that information. And I am asking you, for the last time, who?" Crane's hands trembled at his sides. There had been a visit, weeks earlier, from a well-dressed man representing interests he had been told not to question too closely, a generous purse in exchange for a diagnosis that would be delivered at precisely the right moment, timed to coincide with Aliner's collapse at the winter ball, an event Crane now understood with sickening clarity had likely not been an accident at all. "It was Lord Julian Pemberton," Crane finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "His man came to me weeks ago. He said the Pemberton family had long-standing grievances against House Ashcombe, dating back to disputes over land and title that predate either of our lifetimes. He said if I delivered a certain diagnosis at the right moment, and made certain it seemed unquestionably true, I would be paid more than I earn in 5 years of practice." Gareth's fists clenched at his sides, the full shape of the conspiracy unfolding before him with terrible clarity. The Pembertons had wanted to see House Ashcombe crumble, and they had known exactly how to do it. Not through violence, not through open conflict, but through the quiet, devastating weapon of doubt, planted in the mind of a proud man desperate for an heir. "They knew I would react exactly as I did," Gareth said slowly, almost to himself. "They knew that if I believed Aliner could never give me a child, I would end the marriage without hesitation. They wanted me to discard her. They wanted the Ashcombe line to end with me, unmarried and heirless, while they consolidated power in the vacuum left behind." Crane said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would improve his situation. "Get out of my sight," Gareth said, "and do not think for a moment that this ends here. You will answer for what you have done, to me, and to the woman whose life you nearly destroyed for the price of a purse of coin." Crane fled the study without another word, and Gareth stood alone once more, surrounded by the wreckage of his own poor judgment. He had not questioned the diagnosis. He had not gone to Aliner's bedside to hear her own account of her symptoms. He had not paused, even for a single day, to consider that perhaps the news was wrong before he destroyed the only marriage he had ever known. He had been so consumed by fear of failing his family's legacy that he had failed the one person who had never once failed him. Outside, the night stretched dark and cold over the estate, and somewhere many miles away, in a small cottage at the edge of a village called Fenmore, his son slept peacefully in his mother's arms, unaware of the storm that his birth had already begun to unleash across the noble houses of the realm. Gareth did not sleep that night. He sat at his desk with the fire burning low, staring at nothing, replaying every moment of the past days over and over until they blurred together into a single unbearable truth. He had built his life around the idea that duty and legacy mattered more than anything else, that a duke's first responsibility was to his bloodline, and in service of that belief, he had thrown away his wife the moment she seemed to threaten it. Now that same wife had given him everything he claimed to want, and she had done it entirely without him, in a borrowed cottage, attended by a maid and an elderly caretaker, instead of the finest physicians in the capital that his wealth could have provided. He thought of Eleanor as she had been on their wedding day, laughing beneath the autumn leaves in the estate gardens, her eyes bright with a hope he had not fully appreciated at the time. He thought of the quiet years that followed, the slow erosion of warmth between them as month after month passed without the news he had been waiting for, and how he had let that erosion harden into something colder than it ever needed to be. He had never once asked her how she felt about the years of disappointment. He had only ever asked, in careful, indirect ways, whether there was any news yet. By the time dawn broke over the estate, Gareth had made a decision, though it brought him no comfort. He would ride to Fenmore. He would see his son with his own eyes. And he would face whatever judgment Eleanor chose to deliver, because after everything he had done, he owed her that much and more. He did not yet know that the road to Fenmore would be far more difficult to travel than any distance on a map, or that reaching his wife again would require far more than a single ride and a single apology. The ride to Fenmore took the better part of a day, and Gareth spent every mile of it rehearsing words that felt hollow the moment he tried to shape them into sentences. There was no apology grand enough to undo what he had done. There was no explanation that would make the cruelty of that single night disappear. He arrived at the edge of the village as the afternoon sun slanted low across the rooftops, and he found, almost immediately, that Fenmore already knew exactly who he was and exactly what he had done. The villagers did not bow to him. They watched him with hard, unwelcoming eyes as he rode through the narrow lane toward the little cottage at the edge of the trees, and no one offered to point the way, though everyone clearly knew it. He found it himself, drawn by instinct or perhaps by something he did not want to name, and when he dismounted in front of the small wooden door, his hands were shaking for the first time in longer than he could remember. Margaret answered his knock, and her face, upon seeing him, hardened into something fierce and protective that Gareth had never once seen from a servant in his own household. "You have no right to be here," she said, standing squarely in the doorway. "I know," Gareth said quietly. "I am not asking for rights. I am asking to see my wife and my son if she will allow it." From somewhere behind Margaret, Eleanor's voice carried through the small cottage, tired but unmistakably strong. "Let him in, Margaret. He has come this far. Let us see what he has to say for himself." Margaret stepped aside, though her eyes never left Gareth as he crossed the threshold, and Gareth found himself standing in a small, warm room that smelled of wood smoke and fresh bread, so unlike the cold grandeur of his own estate that for a moment he simply stood still, absorbing the strangeness of it. Eleanor sat near the fire with their son cradled against her chest, and when Gareth's eyes finally settled on the child, something in his chest tightened painfully. The boy had a full head of dark hair, and when he stirred slightly in his sleep, Gareth caught a glimpse of eyes that were unmistakably his own, the same deep brown that ran through generations of Ashcombe portraits hanging in the estate gallery. "He is beautiful," Gareth said, his voice rough with an emotion he did not fully understand himself. Eleanor's expression did not soften. "He is mine," she said. "Whatever claim you believe you have to him, remember that I carried him through months of being told my body had failed, through a diagnosis that nearly destroyed me, through a night when the man who promised to protect me instead sent me away without so much as a conversation. I know, Gareth said. I know what I did. I have no defense for it. Then why are you here? Eleanor asked, and her voice, though quiet, carried the weight of 4 years of accumulated hurt finally given permission to speak. Is it because you want an heir, now that you know one exists? Is that the only reason my door is worth knocking on? No, Gareth said, and he crossed the small room to kneel before her chair, an act so unlike the proud, unbending Duke Eleanor had married that she stared at him in genuine surprise. I came because Dr. Crane's diagnosis was a lie, purchased by Lord Julian Pemberton to destroy this family from the inside. I came because I let my fear of losing everything blind me to the person standing right in front of me. I came because I have spent every hour since that steward burst into my study understanding, more clearly than I have ever understood anything, exactly how badly I failed you. Eleanor's arms tightened slightly around her sleeping son, and for a long moment the only sound in the cottage was the crackling of the fire and the soft, steady breathing of the child between them. Words are easy, Eleanor finally said. You had 4 years to speak to me the way you are speaking now, and instead you gave me silence and cold letters and a diagnosis you never once questioned before throwing me out of my own home. I know, Gareth said again, because it was the only truth he had left to offer. I will not return to the estate simply because a lie has been uncovered, Eleanor said, her voice growing firmer with each word. I will not become convenient again now that I have proven myself useful. I built something here, in this small cottage, with 2 women who never once doubted me, and I will not abandon that simply because you have finally decided to feel guilty. Gareth nodded slowly, understanding that whatever he had hoped to accomplish by riding to Fenmore, it would not be resolved in a single conversation, no matter how honest. Then let me earn it back, he said quietly, not with words, with time, with whatever proof you require. I am not asking you to forgive me tonight. I am asking you to let me try. Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, searching for the coldness that had once lived behind his eyes, and finding instead something she had not seen from him in years, something that looked almost like the young man she had married beneath the autumn leaves, before duty and legacy had hardened him into someone else entirely. You may visit, she said finally, as his father, not as my husband. That is all I am willing to offer for now. It was not forgiveness, but it was not a closed door either, and Gareth accepted it with a quiet nod, understanding that he had no right to expect anything more. Outside the small cottage, the sun continued its slow descent toward the hills, and neither of them yet knew that the danger threatening their small family had not ended with Dr. Crane's confession. It had only just begun to sharpen its focus on the child sleeping so peacefully between them, the unexpected heir whose very existence now threatened everything Lord Julian Pemberton had spent years trying to build. News of the confession Dr. Crane had made spread through the capital almost as quickly as the news of the birth itself, and Lord Julian Pemberton received word of it while seated in his private study, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence that mapped out ambitions he had spent nearly a decade building. He was a tall, composed man with silver at his temples, and a reputation for patience that had served him well in matters of politics and inheritance disputes alike. The letter informing him that Crane had named him before the Duke of Ashcombe made his hand tighten around the paper until it crumpled at the edges, though his expression remained carefully neutral, the way it always did when his careful plans encountered an unexpected obstacle. Send for my steward, Pemberton said to the servant waiting near the door, and send word to my sister in the capital. Tell her I will need her assistance sooner than either of us expected. Pemberton's plan had never been simple cruelty for its own sake. His family had lost significant land, and standing 2 generations earlier in a dispute with the Ashcombe family, a dispute that had left old wounds festering quietly beneath the surface of polite noble society for decades. When Pemberton inherited his title, he had inherited that grievance along with it, and he had spent years watching for an opportunity to see House Ashcombe weakened enough that the old losses might finally be reclaimed. Gareth's desperation for an heir had been the perfect weapon. A duke without a child was a duke whose title would eventually revert to distant, weaker relations, relations far easier for the Pembertons to influence or outmaneuver. All it had taken was a well-placed physician, a generous purse, and the patience to wait for the right moment to strike. The unexpected birth of a healthy heir had shattered that plan in a single night, and now, with Crane's confession threatening to expose the entire scheme, Pemberton understood that he needed a new strategy, one bold enough to salvage what remained of his ambitions. Within days, whispers began circulating through the capital's noble circles, carefully seeded by Pemberton's allies, suggesting that the timing of the birth was suspicious, that a child born so quickly and so conveniently after an annulment could not possibly be legitimate, that perhaps the real father was someone other than the Duke of Ashcombe entirely. It was a cruel and calculated rumor, designed not to convince anyone of the truth, but simply to create enough doubt that the boy's claim to the Ashcombe title might one day be challenged in the courts. Eleanor heard of the rumors from Margaret, who had gone into the village for supplies and returned with her face flushed with anger, repeating what she had overheard from a traveling merchant who did not realize whose maid he was speaking to. "They are saying terrible things, my lady," Margaret said, setting down her basket with hands that trembled from more than the cold. "They are saying the child cannot possibly be the Duke's, that the timing makes it impossible, that you must have deceived everyone." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she did not allow the fear rising in her chest to show on her face. "Let them say what they like," she said. "The truth does not change because cruel men choose not to believe it." "But my lady, if these rumors reach the courts, if they use this to challenge the boy's inheritance—" "I know what is at stake," Eleanor said quietly, glancing toward the small crib where her son slept peacefully, unaware of the storm gathering around his tiny life. "Which is exactly why we cannot simply wait and hope the truth defends itself. We must be prepared to prove it beyond any doubt." It was around this time that an unexpected visitor arrived at the cottage, a woman named Isolde Farrow, representing a noble family long known for their rivalry with the Pembertons over trade routes in the northern counties. She arrived in a modest carriage, without the usual pomp of nobility, and introduced herself to Eleanor with a directness that immediately put the exhausted young mother at ease. "I will not waste your time with false sympathy," Lady Farrow said, seated across from Eleanor in the small cottage parlor. "My family has watched the Pembertons grow too powerful for too long, and I believe your son's legitimate claim to the Ashcombe title is the strongest weapon anyone has held against them in years. I am offering you my family's protection and our influence at court, not out of charity, but because our interests align." Eleanor studied the woman carefully, aware that accepting help from one noble house locked in rivalry with another was not without its own dangers, but also aware that she could not fight the Pembertons alone from a small cottage at the edge of a forgotten village. "What would you require in exchange for this protection?" Eleanor asked. "Only your honesty," Lady Farrow said, "and perhaps, in time, your friendship. I have no interest in controlling you or your son, Lady Ashcombe. I have interest in seeing the Pembertons fail in whatever scheme they are currently plotting, and your survival happens to serve that goal rather perfectly." Eleanor considered the offer carefully, weighing the risk against the growing danger the rumors represented, and finally extended her hand in agreement, understanding that survival sometimes required alliances born of necessity rather than pure trust. "I accept," Eleanor said, "but know this. My son's well-being comes before any political advantage either of our families might gain. If that ever becomes a point of conflict between us, I will choose him without hesitation." Lady Farrow's expression softened slightly, the first genuine warmth Eleanor had seen from her since she arrived. "That," she said, "is exactly the answer I hoped to hear." With Lady Farrow's resources now behind her, Eleanor began preparing for a battle that would not be fought with swords or soldiers, but with evidence, testimony, and the careful, patient work of proving a truth that cruel men were determined to obscure. Dr. Crane's written confession was secured and copied. Witnesses from Fenmore who had been present at the birth were prepared to testify before any court that dared to question the timeline, and Lady Pharaoh's own connections at the capital began quietly working to counter the rumors Pemberton's allies had spread. Meanwhile, Gareth, true to his word, began visiting the cottage regularly, never overstaying his welcome, never pressing Alina for more than she was willing to give. He brought no grand gifts, no attempts to buy back her affection with wealth. Instead, he brought small things. Firewood cut with his own hands when the weather turned colder, books for Alina to read during the long, quiet evenings. Patient hours spent simply sitting near the crib, watching his son sleep, learning the small details of a life he had almost never known. It was during one such visit, weeks into this new and fragile arrangement, that Gareth arrived to find the cottage in an uproar, Margaret pale-faced at the door, and Agnes speaking in low, urgent tones with Lady Pharaoh's messenger, who had ridden through the night to deliver news that could not wait until morning. "What has happened?" Gareth demanded, his heart already sinking with dread. Alina emerged from the back room, her face drawn with worry but her voice steady with the same quiet strength that had carried her through everything else. "Lord Pemberton has petitioned the royal court directly," she said. "He is demanding a formal hearing to determine our son's legitimacy before the entire nobility of the realm. He means to settle this not through rumor, but through law, where he believes his influence and wealth will carry more weight than the truth ever could." Gareth's hands clenched at his sides, the old fury he had felt in his study on that first terrible night returning with renewed force, this time aimed entirely at the man who had orchestrated so much suffering for his own selfish ambitions. "Then we will meet him there," Gareth said, "and we will bring every piece of evidence we possess. He may have influence, but he does not have the truth, and I intend to make certain the entire realm hears it." The royal court convened 3 weeks later in the great hall of the capital, beneath high vaulted ceilings and rows of noble faces eager to witness a scandal that had already become the most talked-about affair in the realm. Alina arrived with her son held carefully in her arms, dressed not in the extravagant silks of a duchess, but in simple, dignified clothing that spoke of quiet resolve rather than desperate persuasion. Beside her stood Margaret, Agnes, and Lady Pharaoh, and behind her, though not beside her, stood Gareth, present as a witness to his own failures as much as a supporter of his wife's cause. Lord Julian Pemberton sat across the great hall with his allies gathered close, his composed expression betraying nothing of the anxiety that had been building within him since Crane's confession first surfaced. He had spent considerable resources ensuring that at least some members of the royal council would view the timing of the birth with suspicion, and he trusted that suspicion, once planted, would be difficult to fully uproot even in the face of evidence. The proceedings began with Dr. Crane himself, summoned under royal order to repeat before the assembled court the confession he had first made in Gareth's study. His voice shook as he spoke, describing in detail the visit from Pemberton's man, the generous purse offered in exchange for a diagnosis timed precisely to coincide with Alina's collapse, and the deliberate falsehood that had convinced Gareth his wife could never bear a child. Pemberton's lawyer rose immediately to challenge the confession, suggesting that Crane had been coerced or bribed by the Ashcombe family to fabricate this story and shift blame away from a genuinely questionable pregnancy timeline. It was a clever attempt at misdirection, and for a moment, murmurs of uncertainty rippled through the assembled nobility. Then Lady Pharaoh rose, presenting the court with sworn testimony gathered from 3 separate villagers in Fenmore, including the village healer Constance, all of whom confirmed the timeline of the birth in precise, consistent detail that left no reasonable room for the kind of deception Pemberton's lawyer had suggested. The child, they testified, had been born fully formed and healthy on the very first night of Alina's arrival in the village, a physical impossibility if the pregnancy had somehow begun after her exile from the estate, as the rumors had implied. Still, Pemberton's allies pressed forward, questioning why a woman who claimed to be pregnant for many months had shown no visible signs of it before her collapse, a detail that gave the assembled council pause until Constance herself stepped forward, unbidden, to explain in plain, practical terms how illness, tightly laced garments, and a body already weakened by whatever ailment had caused her collapse could easily mask the signs of a pregnancy from those who were not looking carefully for them. Particularly when a trusted physician had already convinced everyone around her that pregnancy was impossible in the first place. It was Gareth, finally, who delivered the testimony that shifted the mood of the entire hall. He stood before the royal council, his voice steady despite the shame evident on his face, and spoke not in his own defense but in open acknowledgement of his failures. "I did not question the diagnosis I was given," Gareth said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I did not go to my wife's side to hear her own account of her condition. I allowed fear and pride to convince me of a truth that was never true at all, and in doing so, I nearly destroyed the one person who never once deserved such treatment. Whatever judgment this court renders regarding my son's legitimacy, let it also render judgment on the man who orchestrated this cruelty for the sake of old grievances and ambition. Lord Pemberton did not simply seek to weaken my house. He sought to destroy an innocent woman and her child as a means to an end, and I will not stand silently while he attempts to finish what his lies began." The great hall fell into a heavy silence, broken only when the eldest member of the royal council, a stern woman named Duchess Wren, rose from her seat and addressed the assembly with the quiet authority of decades spent presiding over matters of noble law. "The evidence before this court is clear and consistent," Duchess Wren declared. "The child born to Lady Eleanor Hartley is the legitimate son of Duke Gareth Ashcombe, and any further attempt to challenge this legitimacy without new and substantial evidence will be treated as an act of bad faith against this court. As for the matter of Lord Pemberton's conduct, this council will convene a separate inquiry into the bribery of Dr. Crane and the deliberate manipulation of a physician's diagnosis for political gain, an offense this council takes with the utmost seriousness." Pemberton's composed expression finally cracked, just slightly, as the weight of the council's judgment settled over the hall, and he understood with cold clarity that his years of patient scheming had collapsed in a single afternoon, undone not by force but by the simple, stubborn persistence of truth. As the court adjourned and the assembled nobility began filing out in a buzz of astonished conversation, Eleanor stood holding her son a little tighter, feeling for the first time since that terrible night at the winter ball that the ground beneath her had finally stopped shifting. In the weeks that followed the hearing, Lord Julian Pemberton's carefully constructed reputation collapsed under the weight of the royal inquiry. Dr. Crane, stripped of his license to practice and facing his own separate punishment for accepting the bribe, provided further detail that implicated not only Pemberton, but two of his closest allies, both of whom had assisted in spreading the rumors meant to discredit the boy's legitimacy. Within a month, Pemberton's family lands were placed under royal review, and the influence he had spent a decade building at court evaporated as quickly as it had once seemed unshakable. Eleanor felt no particular satisfaction watching his downfall unfold from a distance. She had spent too many months focused on survival, on protecting her son, on rebuilding a sense of self that had been shattered so completely on that ballroom floor, to find much joy in another person's ruin, even a person who had caused her so much suffering. What she felt instead, as the weeks passed and the danger finally receded, was something quieter and far more valuable. A sense of safety that she had not realized how deeply she had been missing. Gareth continued his visits to the cottage throughout this time, never presuming, never pressing, simply showing up with the same quiet consistency that had slowly, carefully, begun to rebuild something between them that neither of them could yet name. He learned to hold his son properly, awkwardly at first and then with growing confidence, learning the particular rhythm of the boy's cries and the specific way he settled when rocked, a certain gentle motion that Agnes had taught him during one of his early visits. One evening, many months after the hearing had concluded, Gareth arrived at the cottage to find Eleanor sitting outside in the cooling evening air, watching their son take his first wobbling, determined steps across the small garden, his arms outstretched for balance, his face a mixture of fierce concentration and delighted laughter each time he managed 2 or 3 steps before tumbling gently onto the soft grass. "He is walking," Gareth said softly, coming to stand beside her, careful to keep a respectful distance even now, months into their fragile new understanding. "He has been trying for a week," Eleanor said, a genuine smile touching her lips as she watched their son attempt another wobbling journey across the garden. "He does not like failing at anything. I imagine he gets that from his father." Gareth's throat tightened at the small, easy warmth in her voice, a warmth he had feared he might never hear directed at him again. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "I do not ask this to pressure you, and I will accept whatever answer you give without complaint. But I find myself wondering if there might ever be a place for me again, not simply as a visiting father, but as something more." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, watching their son finally reach the far end of the garden and collapse triumphantly into a patch of soft clover, laughing at his own small victory. "I have thought about this many times," Eleanor finally said. "I have thought about the years before, and the night you sent me away, and every visit you have made since, and I do not think I could ever forget what happened, even if I wanted to. But I have also watched you these past months, Gareth. I have watched you learn to be patient in a way you never were before. I have watched you sit with a court full of powerful men and admit your own failures without flinching, simply because it was the right thing to do. That is not the man who signed those annulment papers without a second thought." "I am not asking you to forget," Gareth said quietly. "I am only asking if there is room, in whatever life you choose to build, for me to keep trying to earn back what I threw away." Eleanor turned to look at him fully then, studying his face in the fading evening light, searching one final time for any trace of the cold, distant man she had married 4 years earlier, and finding instead someone who had been genuinely, painfully remade by everything that had happened since that terrible night. "There is room," she said finally, "not all at once, not because the past no longer matters, but slowly the way trust is meant to be rebuilt, one honest day at a time." It was not the sweeping, romantic reconciliation that ballad singers might have composed songs about, no grand declaration beneath autumn leaves or dramatic reunion witnessed by a cheering court. It was something quieter, and in many ways, something far more meaningful. A careful, deliberate choice made by 2 people who had both been changed irreversibly by cruelty, deception, and unexpected resilience, choosing to build something new rather than simply returning to what had been broken before. Their son grew up in the years that followed, knowing both the small cottage in Fenmore where he had been born and the grand halls of the Ashcombe estate where he would one day inherit his father's title. And he grew up, too, hearing the story of his own birth told and retold by Margaret and Agnes with a mixture of pride and wonder. The story of a mother who had been called sick and barren by men who never bothered to look closely enough at the truth, and who had answered their cruelty not with despair, but with the quiet, unstoppable arrival of a son who proved every single one of them wrong. Eleanor never forgot the lesson that night had taught her, that titles and diagnoses and the careful judgments of powerful men meant nothing next to the truth of her own body, her own strength, and her own worth, and she carried that lesson forward not just as a duchess restored to her rightful place, but as a woman who had learned in the hardest possible way exactly how much she was capable of surviving. And in the quiet years that followed, whenever anyone in the capital spoke of the winter her husband deserted her for being sick and barren, only to have their heir born the very next day, Eleanor would simply smile, hold her son a little closer, and let the truth of her own remarkable resilience speak for itself.